Madam Speaker, today I rise in defense of the secret ballot, a cherished tenet of democracy. And I begin again, as I did earlier, by quoting the ruling by Justice Ivan Rand in the matter of Ford Motors versus the United Auto Workers CIO of 1946. Now, before I will quote this passage, let me explain its importance. The ruling of Justice Ivan Rand in 1946 in this dispute has created the framework for our entire union certification and subsequent union financing policy right across the country in all 10 provinces and in the federal jurisdiction. The resolution to which Mr. Justice Rand arrived was that all members of the bargaining unit at Ford Motors would be required to pay union dues, and the union would be required thereafter to provide representation to all of those workers. That union would sign collective agreements and would represent those workers in grievances. However, for the union to control that bargaining unit and act as its agent, it would have to secure majority support from the workers in the unit. How do you determine whether a union has the support of the majority of workers in the bargaining unit? That is what we are debating here today. Now, there are two options. One is a process called card check, where those who want to certify or take over a workplace go around with a petition and ask workers on the floor to sign that petition. When they have enough signatures to reach 50% plus one, they then go to the Labor Relations Board and say, we have a majority, please give us exclusive representational powers over the entire unit. The other option is that once those signatures are collected, the board says you are now authorized to hold a secret ballot vote so that the will and volition of the members of that unit can express themselves free of intimidation from either the employer or the aspiring union. They go into a secret voting box, mark their X, yay or nay, and if the union receives 50% plus one, it becomes the bargaining agent for the union, for the bargaining unit. Now, back to Justice Ivan Rand. Among the very first pages in his ruling, he wrote, and I quote, "But unguarded power cannot be trusted, and the maintenance of social balance demands that the use or exercise of power be subject to controls. Politically, this resides in alert public opinion and the secret ballot." Why? Why do we need a secret ballot? Why can we not simply collect public signatures and have those signatures trigger representation? The answer, of course, is that the only way for a person to truly exercise their will is to do so in the privacy of a walled-in voting booth where they select a yes or a no without anybody finding out what they chose. To deny them of that opportunity means that they could face potential consequences from people on either side of the question at stake. The result is, out in the open, where people are forced to put their names on a public list rather than exercising their will in private, can experience bullying by either the union or the employer for that matter. Now, we heard arguments today from the minister that holding a secret ballot is too costly, too time-consuming, and too difficult for those trying to unionize a workplace. Let's address each one of those objections. Too costly. She points out that under the current law in Canada, in a federally regulated workplace, an aspiring union not only has to collect signatures to trigger a vote, but then has to campaign to win that vote. That ballot boxes have to be arranged so that the vote can be administered. And then, of course, that workers within the bargaining unit have to take the time out of their day to mark an X next to their preferred option. Now, all of those things are true. True in the workplace, true in a general election to select this Parliament. It is true that it takes time to hold a general election. In fact, we shut down this entire Parliament for 36 days. 36 days while no bills are passed, no debates are held, no government announcements are made, almost no government business at the executive level is conducted. Why? Because everybody is too busy devoting their time to this gigantic distraction, this gigantic enterprise that the Liberal Party condemns in the case of workplaces as democracy. Is democracy time-consuming? Of course it is. But when you compare democratic nations to non-democratic nations, we find the return on the investment of that time to be spectacularly worth it.
Indeed, good job.
Cost. Now we know voting costs money. I think the last election cost something like $250 million. Ballot boxes had to be purchased, ballots had to be printed, returning officers had to be hired, voting halls had to be rented. All of these things cost money. But if the government's view is that we can't spare any expense to administer democracy, well, that would be akin to arguing that we can't afford elections in Canada. We know they tried to change the entire voting system to favor themselves without consulting the Canadian people through a referendum. In itself, that action illustrated their hostility to the practice and institution of voting. Could it be that that same contempt has spilled over into Canada's federally regulated workplaces? But I say again, does democracy cost money? Yes, it costs money, and it is worth every single penny expended. It is worth it because it is the only way to truly evaluate the will of those over whom a decision must be made. And speaking of money, what is the decision that is being made when you certify a union in a workplace? You are certifying that union's ability to hold taxation power over all of the workers in that workplace. In Canada, if you work in a unionized bargaining unit, you must pay union dues, even if you choose not to be a member of the union, even if you object to the way in which that money is spent. You are not allowed to opt out of it. We are one of the very few countries in the free and democratic world that has this rule. Increasingly across Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere, workers are given the ability to opt out of union dues because those countries have freedom of association in the workplace. Here in Canada, in all 10 provinces and in the federal jurisdiction, a unionized workplace empowers the bargaining agent to forcefully collect dues against the wishes of many of its members. So the trade-off is that in this system of exclusive majority representation, that you must have at least a majority in order to enjoy that spectacular and unmatched privilege of collecting mandatory dues from people within that sphere. Remember, no other advocacy group in all of Canada enjoys these privileges. Even those groups that advocate on behalf to the benefit of other people do not have that power. Some say, look, unions are fighting for the rights of the workers, therefore those workers should pay for the value of that advocacy, lest we have free riders. Well, the Canadian Cancer Society is fighting for cancer patients, but we do not collect mandatory union dues from cancer patients in order to fund the Canadian Cancer Society. People contribute to it through voluntary donations. I make this point not even to argue against mandatory union dues, but merely to point out the extraordinary privilege that our unions enjoy once they have, in fact, certified a workplace. The least that we can entitle our workers to have is the right to vote on whether that privilege should be extended at their expense. So if the government is so worried about saving money by avoiding the enormous cost of holding a vote, is it not at all worried about the subsequent cost that that certification imposes upon the workers who must pay for it? And of course, Madam Chair, at the risk of being repetitious, I say that if the government believes voting is too expensive in our workplaces, why would Liberals then not simply argue that voting is too expensive in our democracy? In fact, I'm sure if you look through the encyclopedia of tin pot dictators, many have made exactly the same arguments that the government makes today to avoid facing electorates in their own countries. Finally, they say a secret ballot makes things too difficult for the unions. It's too difficult. Yeah. And if there were no secret ballot, then they would succeed at certifying more workplaces more easily. In fact, the minister's predecessor said she came and got a document. She pulled it out of my former department when I was Minister of Employment and Social Development. She said, aha, when there are secret ballots, there's a lower rate of union certification. Gotcha. Now we found out what your agenda is, they said. It was the silver bullet, it was the smoking gun. They said, we have just proved that where workers are given the opportunity to vote, they make decisions that we don't like. And now we have proof of it. And because they make decisions we don't like, we're going to take away their power to make that decision in the first place. That is their idea of democracy. If people vote in a way that the Liberals and special interest groups who back them do not like, well, they'll just take away the right to vote altogether as an unnecessary, costly, and burdensome inconvenience. Madam Speaker, democracy is not an inconvenience. It is the basis of our entire country. Finally, they said that allowing a secret ballot would permit employers to exert undue pressure on workers. Madam Speaker, a secret ballot is secret. The employer does not find out how it is that the worker voted. Only under the regime that this government is trying to reinstate would the employer even know what an employee does with the certification decision. We on this side of the House are trying to free the worker from intimidation and undue influence by both sides in a certification dispute. So we see these four arguments: that secret ballot voting is too costly, that it is too distracting, that it gives employers the ability to influence the outcome, and then finally that it makes it too difficult for a union to certify. Well, I guess the government could argue then the secret ballot is very dangerous in the election of Parliament because it might make it too difficult for Liberals to get elected in future votes, right? It's just too difficult. Therefore, let's find a simpler system that gives them the outcome that they want. Of course, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, this is not about workers or unions or improving workplace dynamics or rebalancing the scales. This is about taking power away from workers to give it to powerful interest groups that helped elect this government. We on this side continue to stand for the right of workers to vote, to determine their own destiny, rather than having it imposed upon them by either this government or any of the interest groups that elect it. And so, Madam Chair, I stand here today and I move seconded by the honourable member for Edmonton Manning, that the motion be amended by deleting all of the words after the word "that" and substituting the following, quote, "The amendments made by the Senate to C4, an act to amend the Canada Labour Code, the Parliamentary Employment and Staff Relations Act, the Public Service Labour Relations Act, and the Income Tax Act, be now read a second time and concurred in." I thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to make this motion. I will submit it to the dais, and I will give the opportunity to all members of the House to reaffirm the Canadian commitment to democracy and one of its central pillars, the right of every man and every woman to carry out their franchise in secret, free from pressure and undue intimidation, that we here highly resolve that this democratic principle will exist across the land and in our workplaces.
Good job.